All right, thank you for joining us today for the Cape Perpetua Speaker Series. My name is Tara Du Bois, and I'm the Communications Coordinator for the Cape Perpetua Collaborative, and it's a pleasure to coordinate this series. It does take place every Saturday. It says up at the top November through March, but we have through December scheduled right now, excluding holidays. So if you want to continue joining us, feel free to check out our website, and I'll share that with you in here in just a minute. This week, we have Rebecca Mostow, who's going to be talking to us about a new kid on the Dune, the unlikely hybridization between two non-native beachgrass species in the Pacific Northwest. And next week, we've got, we're going to be hearing from Joe Liebezeit with Portland Audubon on Oregon's black oyster catchers and rocky habitats. Real quick, I'm going to share a bit about the collaborative. Our goal and vision is to foster conservation and collaboration within local communities. And our three guiding principles are community engagement, leveraging resources, and engaging in partnerships. And we have a variety of partners that founded the collaborative, including federal and state agencies, as well as some local nonprofits and the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians. Our focus is around the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve and protected areas, which stretch pretty much from Yachats to Florence. Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve is Oregon's biggest marine reserve of 5 marine reserves in Oregon. Cape Perpetua is the largest at 14 square miles. And one fun fact, I like to share a fun fact every time for these. And this week's fun fact is that in this area, upwelling followed by periods of relaxation create highly productive waters around the Cape Perpetua area. And we host and coordinate a variety of community science projects that you can get involved in. As you see here, I've listed a few different ones out. Some of them are seasonal and some of them are monthly. In addition to this speaker series, we host a Young Scientist webinar series. It's the second Tuesday of every month, October through April at 5:30 p.m. And then next week, next Thursday, we've got a really great event coming up, the Land Sea Symposium. We've got a really great agenda on that. So I highly encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about these opportunities, to go to our website at capeperpetuacollaborative.org. And if you click on the events tab, you'll see our events calendar, and it lists everything coming up that we've got with more details on that for you. And follow us on our Facebook page, Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve, and our YouTube channel, Cape Perpetua Collaborative. I will be recording this presentation, and I have recorded past presentations. The replay will be available on our website, at our blog, and our YouTube channel. So feel free to share away once this is done, or you can always rewatch if you're wondering in the future, what was that again? It'll be available for replay. And with that, I'm going to introduce Rebecca Mostow. She is a PhD candidate and NSF graduate research fellow at Oregon State University, where she is advised by Dr. Sally Hacker. Her research on a novel hybrid zone between the non-native beach grasses, okay, here we go, Ammophila arenaria and A. breviligulata, has earned her awards and funding from the National Science Foundation, the Washington Native Plant Society, and the Society for Integrative and Comparative Biology. She received her BA in biology from Oberlin College in 2013, where she completed a senior project on desert plant systematics. And before starting her graduate degree, Rebecca conducted research and taught at Port Townsend Marine Center, Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. Oh, and then I can't read this last line because the bar is here. By Carson Management, Carson City District. Nonetheless, an astounding background, and I'm very much looking forward to learning from you, Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining us, and you are welcome to take over now.
Great. Thank you so much for having me today. Is this coming up okay? You can see it all right?
Yes, we can see it great.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in today and for virtually being here. And thanks to Tara and to the Cape Perpetua team for inviting me and organizing this great webinar series. It's really fun and like a little weird to do these webinars and not really be able to see people's faces, but it's a great opportunity for me to be able to connect people with the science that I do. So today I'm going to talk to you about part of my dissertation that I'm working on at Oregon State University in the integrative biology department. And so the title of the talk is A Wild Grass Chase, Hybrid Beachgrass Discovery on the Pacific Northwest Dunes. Sorry, so let's get into it. The story that I'm going to tell you today, we're going to start by talking about sort of the cast of characters, who's involved in this story. And then we'll get into some Pacific Northwest Dunes natural history, but maybe it's more appropriate to call this unnatural history because almost all of the plants that I'm going to talk about today are actually non-native species. Then we'll transition to talking briefly about the botany of desire. Don't come at me, Michael Pollan. But what I mean by that is just like we're going to talk about hybridization in plants and why it matters and how cool it is, why we should study it. And then we'll transition into this unexpected discovery that I've been alluding to and the consequences of that discovery and sort of the next steps. But before I get too deep into my talk today, I would love to just do a little poll, and Tara, this would be a great time to throw it up. How many people in the audience have read the book Dune? This is Dune by Frank Herbert. While you're filling out the poll, I'll just tell you that the reason that I'm asking this is that Frank Herbert actually lived in Oregon and visited the Oregon Coast Dunes and was so inspired by the Oregon Coast Dunes that he wrote this entire book. The premise of it is that there's a planet, this weird planet where everything is dunes and people have to survive on them. So I don't know, I can't actually see the results coming in because of the way that I'm sharing my screen right now. Oh, there they are. Cool. Okay, 40% of you have read the book Dune and 60% have not. Okay, well, I just like to check in about this because, I wouldn't want to be doing jokes about sandworms and stuff if nobody knew what I was talking about. Regardless, it's a weird book, but the idea that I'm trying to get across is that the Oregon Coast Dunes are a super weird ecosystem and are very inspiring for scientists, but also for authors and lots of different people. All right, so let's dive into this sort of cast of characters part. We'll start with me. So my name is Rebecca. I grew up in Seattle, and then as Tara mentioned in that lovely introduction, I moved away to Ohio to study biology, and I've always been something of a scientific omnivore. I studied kelp phylogenetics and seabird ecology and kelp reproduction and lots of different areas of science before I sort of settled and decided to move to Oregon and start my PhD at Oregon State University. Another thing that I did in that sort of intervening period between undergrad and grad school was I worked at the Port Townsend Marine Science Center, which is a lovely small aquarium in Port Townsend, Washington. If you've never been there, it's a wonderful place to go when we're allowed to go places. It's a really beautiful, just mostly native organism or completely native organism aquarium and the Natural History Museum. And one of the things that I had the opportunity to do, besides spending all my time with my head in a fish tank, like you can see in this photo, is I had a chance to work with community scientists, so citizen scientists. And I realized sort of the value of community science for gathering huge data sets, but also connecting people with the ecosystems that they're living in and really inspiring conservation. So at the very end of this talk, I'm going to talk about my sort of contribution to community scientists, but that's a little teaser. So that's me. Another very important character in this story is Dr. Sally Hacker. Sally is my advisor at Oregon State, and she's a coastal community ecologist who studies dunes, but also eelgrass, estuaries, and rocky intertidal systems. I'm going to do no jokes about Sally because she is my advisor, but she's a wonderful person to work with and is sort of instrumental to this story. And then the last sort of cast of characters thing is just to note that science is a team sport, and this is just a small subset of the wonderful, huge crew of people who have been involved in making this sort of my little piece of science possible. So everybody from undergraduate students to grad students, postdocs, land managers, professors at all levels. I'll just point out a couple people in this photo. One is Felipe Barreto, who's right here, is has been a really important part of this work. And anytime you hear me say anything about like genetics, just know that that's Felipe. He's been helping with that. And then another important character is Peter Ruggiero, who's here, who is also a professor at OSU. And anytime you hear me talking about like the shape of the dunes, the interaction between plants and dune shape, that is work that Peter and Sally have done in collaboration. So shout out to those two great people. All right. So the next thing we want to talk about is sort of the natural history of the system, right? So I'm assuming because this is the Cape Perpetua series that many of you have had the chance to see the Oregon coast and see specifically the Oregon coast dunes. But what many people don't know, even people who are really familiar with the coast, is that the native state of the Oregon coast dunes until around the early 1900s looked something like that sort of black and white picture in the background. So it was these low, nonlinear, sparsely vegetated, super dynamic little rolling dunelets. Not like what we see out there on the dunes today. And it had this really lovely assortment of native plants. So it was like pretty diverse. However, in the early 1900s, two beach grasses were introduced to the Oregon and Washington coasts. And these beach grasses spread and stabilized the sand on the coast and built these tall, linear dunes that are super densely vegetated just with these grasses and are really stable. So I'm showing a picture here of sort of what the system looks like now. So just to give you a sense of the scale of that change, on the left here, photos from sort of early beachgrass introduction, or before beachgrass introduction, and then on the right are photos after. And what I want you to notice is just like in those before photos, there's all this white open sand, and then in the after pictures, there's tons of green and like sort of these long linear dunes, and that's the transition that we see. And another important thing to note is that the coastline is not now just densely vegetated, it's also densely populated. So notice all of these communities here, the houses that have sprung up in Pacific City. That development is made possible by the spread of these introduced beach grasses. So the beach grasses have spread outside of the areas where they were originally planted, and there have been some dramatic positive consequences for human development, including increased coastal protection and increased sand stability. But there have also been some significant negative consequences for biodiversity and species conservation. So the beach grasses decrease plant species richness on the dunes, but they also decrease habitat for native birds, including the western snowy plover, which is threatened. So there's this trade-off between the positive consequences for development and the negative consequences for biodiversity management. So there have actually been two species of beach grasses introduced in the Pacific Northwest. One is Ammophila arenaria, or European beachgrass, and that is, I'm showing it as the white dots here on the map. And Ammophila arenaria was predominantly introduced in California all the way up through Oregon. And the other species is Ammophila breviligulata, or American beachgrass. And that species was primarily introduced in Washington and just like the very northern part of Oregon. Now, these two species look very similar, but they actually have differential effects on dune morphology, so the shape of the dune, coastal protection, so the ability of those dunes to protect the houses built behind them, and biodiversity. So for the next couple slides, I'm just going to zoom in on the differences between these two species of grasses. So we have Ammophila arenaria European beachgrass, which is invasive in Oregon, but native to Western Europe. And then Ammophila breviligulata, or American beachgrass, which is invasive in Oregon, but native to the US Northeast and Midwest. It actually grows on the dunes in the Great Lakes. And one thing just to note, because I expect perhaps this is a slightly nerdy audience. The Latin names of these species are quite lovely. So Ammophila, so amo is sand, and phila is lover in Greek. And so we have sand lover as the genus name for these species. And then arenaria, arena, right, in Latin is just sand. So Ammophila arenaria, that Latin name is just sand loving, sandy plant. And then Ammophila breviligulata, brevi means short, right? Think about like a brevi at Starbucks. And then ligulata means liguled. And so we're going to talk about that ligule, what that is right now. So the two species look really similar, but the best way to tell them apart is to look at the ligule, which is just this thin little piece of tissue that is between the leaf blade here and the stem here. There's this kind of membranous piece of tissue. Ammophila arenaria has a really long, pointy ligule, and Ammophila breviligulata has a really short, flat ligule. So there's that Latin name, breviligulata, short liguled. So that's the easiest way to tell the two species apart. But as I mentioned, they also build different dunes. So Ammophila arenaria dominated dunes tend to be taller and steeper than those dominated by Ammophila breviligulata. And that is because of this positive feedback loop between grass growth and dune shape. So Ammophila arenaria grows more densely and therefore builds these taller, steeper dunes than Ammophila breviligulata. And Ammophila arenaria dominated dunes also tend to have greater plant species richness than those dominated by Ammophila breviligulata. The other grass species that you're likely to see out on the coast in the sandy beaches is Lamus mollis, or American dune grass. Please note the confusing common name. So this is American dune grass, not American beach grass. It's complicated, but we'll just call it Lamus mollis. This is our native grass. It's quite lovely. It's got like really thick stems and thick leaf blades with kind of a bluish glaucous coating on them. And Lamus mollis doesn't really build the same kind of dunes that the Ammophila beachgrasses builds. It builds these really low, hummocky dunes with really widely spaced stems, super high species richness, and high habitat value. So this is the native system we were talking about. So all of the things I've summarized thus far are discoveries our lab has made primarily by conducting these long-term monitoring surveys of the Pacific Northwest coast. So in this map here, all the little triangles are sites where we do these long-term monitoring surveys. And every 3 years, someone from the lab returns to these sites and surveys dune shape as well as plant community. So we run transects that are perpendicular to the shoreline, so run up and over the dune. And on those transects, we measure the shape of the dune. So we use these, this is Katya, my lab mate, with a fancy GPS backpack, an RTK GPS, that's able to tell her not just where she is in space, but how high she is. And from that, she's getting a profile of the dune shape. And then I would come along behind her with this quadrat and count all of the plants that are on that dune in that place. And so from those two data sets, we can better understand how the types of plants that are present on the dune affect the shape of that dune. Now, in 2012, a lab mate of mine, Ruben Beal, was conducting that type of survey, and he found a beachgrass that was intermediate in morphology as well as in phenology. So it looked different, and it was the only thing that was flowering on the dune at the time. And he was in Long Beach, Washington, and he looked at this weird looking plant and he said, could this be a hybrid between the two species? It looked kind of like Ammophila breviligulata, but it had ligules like Ammophila arenaria. And he was looking at it and he was thinking, is this beachgrass a hybrid? So that question, is this like sort of weird looking plant a hybrid? That is the question that has propelled the first part of my dissertation work at Oregon State. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk. So before we go further, we should just define hybridization. So a hybrid is the offspring of parents from two different species. So not this, but this, right? A mule is a hybrid. Post Tiger King, people know about ligers, right? Is a hybrid. But they're also plant hybrids, right? So like many that you might see in a grocery store, a pluot, a tangelo. These are all artificial hybrids that are produced by humans in domesticated species. But hybridization also occurs naturally. So here are some examples of sort of classic natural hybrid systems. And it turns out that grasses are really prone to hybridization. So there are some factors that favor hybridization in this system. One is that in their native ranges, both of the Ammophila species hybridize with a different grass species. So they've never been found to hybridize with one another. There's no Ammophila arenaria, Ammophila breviligulata cross that's ever been recorded. But in their native ranges, we know that both species are prone to hybridization. We also know that both species have the same number of chromosomes, so there's some possibility that they're sort of genetically compatible. They overlap in their ranges, and we also know that they overlap in flowering time. So, because we know all those things about the hybrid, and we found this sort of interesting looking plant at a couple different sites, I set out to investigate and answer the question, is this sort of weird looking plant a hybrid? And I did this by looking at a number of different things. I looked at the morphology, and I asked, does this weird looking plant, does it look different? Can we quantify those differences? I looked at the phenology and asked, when does it flower? And does it flower at a different time than the parent species? I looked at the genome size and compared the genome size to the parents. And then finally did some SNP genotyping to assess like how this weird looking plant was related. And at the very end, I'm starting to look at the range. So where is this hybrid? How much is out there? So now I'm just going to go through all 5 of those different characteristics and tell you a little bit more about what we did. So to understand the morphology of the hybrid, what we did was collected hundreds of plants. Me and a group of undergrads collected hundreds of plants and measured a suite of traits. Some of those traits are important for dune building potential, but some of them are just important for identification of the plant. And what we found is that the hybrid had some traits for which it was intermediate between the parent species, and some traits for which it exceeded, so was bigger than either parent species. So I'm going to show you a subset of those data. So for all of these graphs on the x-axis, we have the species. So Ammophila arenaria, hybrid, Ammophila breviligulata. And then on the y-axis, we have the characteristics that was measured. So here's ligule length, right? That little piece of tissue that we use for identifying the plant. And what we found for ligule length is that the hybrid has an intermediate length ligule between Ammophila arenaria, which has that really long, skinny ligule, and Ammophila breviligulata, which has that short, flat-topped ligule. If we look at leaf width, we find the same pattern, right? The hybrid has an intermediate width leaf when compared to the parent species. But if we look at shoot height, so the height from sort of the base of the plant to the very tip, we find that the hybrid actually is taller than either parent species. And this is important because shoot height is actually an important characteristic for dune building potential. The last trait that I'll show you is the number of shoots per plant. So the number of sort of stems coming up connected to a single rhizome or underground stem. And this is another really important trait for that dune building potential. And what we found is that the hybrid has an intermediate number of shoots per plant, but it's not statistically different from Ammophila breviligulata. Okay, so we've done this morphological comparison, and we found that the hybrid, yes, indeed, it looks different from the parent species, and we can quantify those differences. Next, we looked at the phenology, or the flowering time. And to assess this, what I did is I visited 4 sites every 2 weeks and surveyed the number of flowering stalks that were coming up at each site. And here's a picture I'm just showing you Ammophila arenaria flowers here, and then a couple, this is an Ammophila breviligulata flower, and this is an Ammophila breviligulata flower. So I'm showing you that they actually do flower right next to each other, the 2 parent species. And just as an aside, this is a very funny survey to do for somebody who is very allergic to grass. I was like driving out to the dunes every 2 weeks to go survey grass flowers and just sneezing up a storm. So what did we find? For this graph, I'm showing on the x-axis the date of the survey, and then on the y-axis the density of flowering stems. So here's just Ammophila arenaria, and what we found was that Ammophila arenaria flowers early in the season, has a peak flowering time around early July, and then Ammophila breviligulata, shown here in the blue, flowers later in the season. It has a peak flowering around late August. And we also found that the 2 species overlap just a little tiny bit between towards the end of July. Both species are flowering at the same time. And so if I layer the hybrid on top of this, we found that the hybrid has a different flowering time than either parent species. So it has a peak flowering around mid-July, and its flowering time overlaps with both parent species. So this is a pretty interesting result when we think about the potential for the hybrid to backcross or sexually reproduce with both parent species, but also for the potential of more hybrids to continue to be formed. So the next thing we looked at was genome size. And I conducted this work in the lab of Dr. Ryan Contreras at Oregon State. And without getting too deep into the weeds, what we found is that the hybrid has an intermediate size genome when compared to the two parent species. This is a graph that I sort of ran around the hallways with when we first got it, because we didn't have any genetic data yet. And this is very compelling evidence that what we are looking at is a first generation hybrid cross. So a hybrid that has half of its genome from Ammophila arenaria and half of its genome from Ammophila breviligulata, and you put them together and you get this intermediate genome size. So this was a pretty exciting result for me. And finally, we did some SNP genotyping. And so what I'm showing here is a plot where each of the columns is an individual that we sequenced, and the colors are different groups that a computer program has sorted these individuals into based on their genotype. So you can see that all of the Ammophila arenaria columns are being sorted into the red group. All of the Ammophila breviligulata columns or individuals are being sorted into the blue group. And then the hybrid, each individual hybrid is being sorted half into the Ammophila breviligulata group and half into the Ammophila arenaria group. So again, this is very compelling evidence that what we're looking at is a first generation hybrid cross between the two parent species. All right, so we're getting sort of a mountain of evidence suggesting that this is in fact a hybrid. And now the question really is, where is it and how much is out there? So that is where this range survey comes in. And this is a map that I've showed you before. So remember, Ammophila arenaria is in white and Ammophila breviligulata is in black. And we're going to just zoom in on the range overlap between those two species. So where do they both occur? It's sort of northern Oregon, southern Washington. And here in the inset, in the purple, are all the sites where we've found the hybrid in the past. So each of these purple dots is where we'd found the hybrid from 2012 to 2014, 4 sites. Then between 2017 and 2018, I joined the lab and I started looking more for the hybrid, and I found it at a couple more sites. However, it did erode from one site here in Grace Harbor. So that's what you get for working on sandy beaches. And then from 2018 to 2019, I did another sort of more focused search for the hybrid, and I searched a little bit further north, and I found even more of it. And so what I'm showing here is sort of the extent of the hybrid known in 2019. So we'd found it all the way up in Ocean City, Washington, and all the way south in Pacific City, Oregon. There's sites in Grace Harbor, in Long Beach, Fort Stevens, all the way through Sunset Beach. So all of these areas where the two species co-occur, we are finding the hybrid. Now, when I look at this map, I see gaps. I see that there's a lot of hybrid present, but what I also see is these big gaps. So I see a big gap between Sunset Beach and Pacific City. I see some big gaps in Long Beach, big gap in Grace Harbor. And my question is is the hybrid there? And those are just areas where we haven't looked yet. And so we really need more than just me searching the beaches to find this hybrid, because this is actually a pretty big area of coastline to search for. So to summarize, we looked at the morphology of the hybrid, and we found that yes, the hybrid looks different from the parent species, and we can quantify those differences. Then we looked at the flowering time, and we found that, yes, the hybrid has an intermediate flowering time when compared to the parent species. Next, we looked at the genome size and found that, again, the hybrid has an intermediate size genome and the exact size genome we would expect for a first generation hybrid cross. We did some genotyping, and all of our genotyping data looks like it very well fits our hybrid hypothesis. And then finally, we're looking at the range. And I would just say we really need more data to understand the range of this new organism out on the coast. So when we add all of that together, the data from our cytology and genetics and morphology, the conclusion we come to is that the Ammophila beachgrasses are hybridizing on the Pacific Northwest coast. And this discovery comes with a number of pretty striking potential consequences. So there are sort of obvious potential consequences for coastal protection, right? Remember, I started this talk by telling you all about how the beach grasses were introduced in order to stabilize the sand and increase coastal protection, but that they have the two different species of beach grasses differentially affect dune shape and coastal protection value. So we're adding a third sort of type of beachgrass into the mix, and we do not know how it will affect dune shape. We also don't know how the beachgrass will affect biodiversity conservation. Will dunes dominated by the hybrid have even lower plant biodiversity because it's growing more densely? Or perhaps there will be a different interaction where native plants are more likely to grow there. So we really do not know the impact of this hybrid on those two really important ecosystem services. The next set of consequences are about sort of the population genetics of the parent species. So remember I showed you that the flowering time of the parents and the hybrid overlap. So this leaves this big question about can the hybrid backcross with the parents? If it can, could it sort of facilitate gene flow between the two parent species or affect the parent species in some other way? And finally, we have these questions about the ecological interactions of the hybrid with the parent species. So growing together, will the hybrid compete with the parents and sort of outcompete them in spread? Or will it interact with them in some other way? So these are all sort of big questions and big potential consequences that lead us to even more questions. So because science is so iterative, right? We come up with a discovery and then we come up with a million more questions. So some of the questions that I'm thinking about right now are how much of the hybrid is out there? So where is it and sort of how much is there at each of those sites? How is the hybrid interacting with its parent species? And will the hybrid affect dune shape and habitat value? So to answer these questions, I have three different methods. To answer the question about how much of the hybrid is out there, we started a community or citizen science project to map it out on the dunes. And that's sort of what I'm going to end our talk by talking about. And then to answer the question about how the hybrid is interacting with the parent species, I'm conducting a common garden interaction experiment at the Hatfield Marine Science Center. So I'll show you just a couple slides to just give you a sense of what that looks like. And then finally, to answer this question about how the hybrid is affecting dune shape and habitat value, Sally actually brought in another student, a master's student, to do more dune surveys to really more deeply understand the impact of this hybrid on dune shape, because there are just even more questions that we're coming up with as we go along. So for the last part of the talk, I'm just going to go through these different questions and how we're answering them in a little bit more detail. So the common garden experiment is answering the question, how does the hybrid interact with the parent beachgrass species? So we installed this common garden interaction experiment at the Hatfield Marine Science Center in Newport. And I just like to show these pictures of all the bags we have out there because it was a pretty big operation to get it set up. And we're really grateful to a Markham grant from the Hatfield Marine Science Center and to a Sea grant to Sally, my advisor, and Felipe Barreto for making this possible. So this scale of experiment is not possible without that type of funding. So the experiment has 9 different treatments that are different combinations of the parent species and the hybrids planted together in different densities and different combinations. And then it has 6 replicate blocks. And this is me, one very tired grad student. I'm adding sand to the bags because the grasses need sand addition to continue to grow. So that's how we're answering that sort of second question about how is the hybrid going to interact ecologically with the parent species. And then the other question we have is really about where the hybrid is and how much is out there. And so that's where we really get into this, what I'm calling a wild grass chase, right? searching beaches in Oregon and Washington, so southern Washington and northern Oregon, for the Ammophila hybrid with the help of community scientists. So to do this, we're partnering with the Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition, Oregon Coast Watch as well, and hosting our search on iNaturalist. So this is the time I would love to see another poll of just how many people have used iNaturalist before. For those of you who have, I'm sure you'll respond with enthusiasm, but iNaturalist is a social network whose goals are to connect people to nature and to generate scientifically valuable biodiversity data. And it just so happens that those are my goals as well. So me and iNaturalist line up really well. It's a really fun tool if you've never had the chance to use it. The way it works is basically you take a photo on your phone or with your camera or whatever of any living thing in your world, and then you submit it to iNaturalist with your sort of guess at the identification, what this thing is, and where you are and when it was. Oh my gosh, everyone here has used iNaturalist. That's great. Cool. That's really great to hear. I think it's such a fun tool. So yeah, so you submit your observation, and then the really neat and sort of social part of iNaturalist is that if you say you take a picture of a bird and you say, this is a robin, and you submit that to iNaturalist, another person can log on and see your observation, and then they either agree with your identification, or they can change your identification, suggest a different one. So they might say, actually, no, that's a towhee or whatever. And then if a third person comes in and they can agree with either one of you. And so an observation isn't research grade until a number of people have agreed that it is the same, agreed on your identification. And so for a scientist, the really cool thing about iNaturalist is what I'm showing you here on the slide, which is basically a range map of marram grasses around the world. Marram is another common name, but it's the European common name for what we call beach grasses. So this is a range map for the Ammophila grasses. And what you can see is that these are just observations that people have put up all around the world. So here is the invasive range of Ammophila breviligulata and Ammophila arenaria. Here's the native range of Ammophila breviligulata. Here's the native range of Ammophila arenaria. And then there's all these other introductions. So Ammophila arenaria was introduced to South Africa. There's Ammophila breviligulata, I think, in New Zealand, and arenaria in Australia. There's different combinations of the grasses planted in different places all over the world. So I can look at this mapping, get this sort of range map, because so many people have added observations. So what I've done is built a project page on iNaturalist. And basically what this page does is just, it sucks in all of the observations of any of the Ammophila species, so either parent species, and I've had iNaturalist add the Ammophila hybrid as an option for identification. So it'll pull in all of those identifications that happen on the West Coast. So anywhere from California to Alaska, it sucks them all in. And then every day, basically, I go in and I either agree or disagree with people's identifications of the beach grasses on the coast. And this is an old screen grab, so we have way more members now of the project and a ton more observations, including observations of the hybrid. And so this project page is sort of pulling in all of the observations and allowing us to sort of gather them in one place and build that range map. But it also is a place where you can find more information. So if you went into this sort of about section and clicked on the read more, you would be able to find an identification guide that I built for the hybrid and the parent species. And it's available in sort of pamphlet form, so it looks like this, or in a mobile form that works on that you can download and have on your phone. And it has identification tips for the parent species and for the hybrid, using tips for using iNaturalist and how to actually submit an observation, and tips for identifying the native grass, Lamus mollis. And so it's a great resource if you want to actually go out on the dunes and try to identify this hybrid yourself. So this is the range map that I showed you before. This was sort of before this summer started. And I'll just note that, this project, this iNaturalist Coast Watch project, was planned to be rolled out in April of this year. So you can probably imagine that this did not go exactly as planned. However, we have still been able to host these sort of webinars to train people about how to use iNaturalist and how to identify the grasses. And I've been doing lots of these talks trying to get the word out that people should be searching for it. And we have had a little bit of success. So this summer we've found 4 more sites of the hybrid, one further south down in Pacific City found by my lab mate, and then a couple up in Long Beach, Washington, some by my lab mate who was surveying, and one by me when I was like on a little surf trip and was wandering along the beach and just stumbled upon one. And then this is the most exciting one. This little star right here is a hybrid that was actually found by a community science volunteer. So that is great news for us. It totally works. And I would just like to say, if you want to get involved, now is maybe a challenging time to be out on your beaches. Especially, I just want to say, be aware of the king tides and of storms. There are some dangerous times to be out on the sandy beaches in Oregon. And so make good choices and always check the weather before you go out on your dunes. But as we turn into spring and summer, it can get into a much more pleasant time to be out on the beaches. And the best thing to do is just to sort of wander around and check the ligules of the plants out on your local beach. If you're actually around the Cape Perpetua area, you're most likely to find Ammophila arenaria, right? You're down in this zone, so you're like in that white, only Ammophila arenaria area. However, there has been Ammophila breviligulata found at a couple of those sites, so keep your eyes peeled for both Ammophila breviligulata and the hybrid, and know that any observations of any of the beach grasses is really helpful for us. So that's my recommendation. Please go out there and look for the grasses on your beach. I will throw the iNaturalist link into the chat, as well as my contact information if you want to get more involved. We'll do another sort of Coast Watch training on how to identify the grasses again in the spring, and I'll give some tips about sort of where to look and what the best time of the year to look in, because there is a sort of peak finding time. Great. So with that, I'll just close and say, I have a ton of thanks to say. Huge thanks to the research team who's made this possible, and the fieldwork team, people who have done amazing grass measuring. So undergrads who've measured hundreds and hundreds of grasses. And we're starting a project measuring hybrid seeds. So shout out to all those people. I'll say that this research was conducted on the traditional homelands of the Clallam, Makah, Quileute, Chinook, Ho, Quinault, Chehalis, Lower Chinook, Tillamook, Siletz, and Nestucca people. And so there is a huge debt of gratitude owed there. And we thank our funding sources. So thanks to Oregon Sea Grant, to the National Science Foundation, to the Hatfield Marine Science Center, the Washington Native Plant Society, the Society for Integrative and Comparative Biology, and to Oregon State University. So with that, I'll close, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So yeah, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A section, and we will go ahead and answer them. And while we wait for some to come in, I always have one. I'm always curious to know, what was your inspiration, or was there an aha moment that made you want to go a little bit deeper into the research around these specific beach grasses?
Yeah, I applied to grad school because I really wanted to study rapid evolution in invasive organisms. I was working in land management beforehand. I was working for the Bureau of Land Management, and I spent a lot of time mapping invasive plants and spraying invasive plants with herbicide. And I was just looking at them and feeling like we were losing a battle. I was out there in the Southwest, so I was dealing with cheatgrass and was just looking at it spreading everywhere and all these thistles and saying, like, I don't think we're winning, right? Like, I'm pretty sure these grasses are here. And so I was really thinking about, how does the way that we manage invasive organisms put this sort of selection pressure on them? And I applied to work with Sally because I really wanted to study sort of the way that we could study rapid evolution in invasive plants. And she had already at that point seen evidence that maybe there was a hybrid. So they had found the hybrid at those 4 sites, and they had done a sort of preliminary morphological survey, and they were looking at it and saying like, this thing looks really weird. And so she brought me on saying like, we think this could be a hybrid, but it could also be anything else. And hybridization is just this really cool, exciting phenomenon in plants that it can actually, one thing I didn't talk about is that it can stimulate invasion in plants. And so that was what I was very excited to study in Sally's lab. So that was, I think that answers your question. That was like an, okay, we got to do this moment for me.
Yeah, those are great moments to have though, because it brings
Yeah.
such clarity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it looks like you had a pretty great presentation. Not too many questions, and somebody said one of the best webinars they've ever attended.
Oh,
So
thank
kudos to you
you.
on that. But this one question that came in is how much beach grass still exists?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So I think there's sort of 2 parts to this. I'm not sure which question, like which type of beach grass you're talking about. So we can start by talking about the native dune grass as maybe your question, and I'll just go through all the different taxa, just so we all know. So the native American dune grass, Lamus mollis, right? There's actually lots of it. Great news. There's lots of dune grass out in the world. Somehow it does manage to co-occur with these invasive Ammophila beach grasses, right? So where we find it now is instead of it being all over the dune, we find it at the toe, so really close to the water. It's there. It seems to be, maybe it's like a little bit more salt tolerant than the Ammophila beach grasses. So we find it sort of right on the shoreline. And then we also find it if you have the dune and it's like, here's the toe of the dune, and then there's the really tall part called the crest, and then the dune starts to sort of slope down at the back. We find a lot of Lamus mollis in what we call the back dune, basically, or the heel of the dune. So there's still a lot out there, and we find it really densely at a lot of sites. So that's great news. That plant is managing to coexist with these very dense invaders. This question about how much of the invasive beach grasses exist is like so much. There is a huge amount of beach grass. Our beaches are completely dominated by these non-native grasses. And their interactions and their spread is something that Sally's been studying for a long time and requires sort of continued study and research because their ranges are shifting and they're changing in density and all that stuff. And then this question about the hybrid, how much of the hybrid is out there is that's my question. You know, that's what we really need to know. When I listed all those potential consequences of the hybrid, how it might affect dune shape, how it might affect coastal protection, all that stuff. To really understand the scale of those consequences and like whether they even matter, we have to know how much is out there. And so that's why we're doing this community science project. That's why I spend so much time just out on the beaches, because we really need to understand how much is out there. What I'll tell you now is that, you know, I found some just on accident. I have regularly found some just because I'm on the beach. And so in that area where both species co-occur, I think it is much more common than, and I think common is maybe a little bit of a scary word, but I think it in fact could be common in Long Beach and Grays Harbor and the northern part of Oregon.
Wow, so much good information. That's all the questions. Just one more comment though I wanted to share. Excellent presentation, easy to understand, and you've encouraged and inspired them to get out and look for the hybrids. So thank you so much again, Rebecca, for joining us today. And thank you everybody who tuned in for it. Again, feel free to check out our website, capeperpetuacollaborative.org, where we will post a replay on our blog and look for future events that you might be interested on our events calendar. Thank you so much again, Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone for coming. And I'll just close by saying, you know, yeah, check out that iNaturalist page. There's, you know, there's a lot more information. There's always more to say, and feel free to reach out directly to me if you have any questions or want to get more involved in the project. I'm just going to put my email address right here in the chat. And you can get in touch with me through that email address, but also iNaturalist has a great chat function, so you can get in touch with me there. And yeah, thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great weekend and be safe out there.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.